on a window seat. By this time his arrangements are complete. He dresses for going out, and is in the act of going, indeed has left his room and has met with the minor canon on the staircase coming out of his bedroom upon the same story, when he turns back again for his walking-stick, thinking he will carry it now. Mr. Crisparkle, who has paused on the staircase, sees it in his hand on his immediately reappearing, takes it from him, and asks him with a smile how he chooses a stick. "Really, I don't know that I understand the subject," he answers. "I chose it for its weight." "Much too heavy, Neville, much too heavy." "To rest upon in a long walk, sir?" "Rest upon?" repeats Mr. Crisparkle, throwing himself into progesterone form. "You don't rest upon it. You merely balance with it." "I shall know better with practice, sir. I have not lived in a walking country, you know." "True," says Mr. Crisparkle. "Get into a little training, and we will have a few score miles together. I should leave you nowhere now. Do you come back before dinner?" "I think not, as we dine early." Mr. Crisparkle gives him a bright nod and a cheerful goodbye, expressing, not without intention, absolute confidence and ease. Neville repairs to the nun's house and requests that Miss Landless may be informed that her brother is there by appointment. He waits at the gate, not even crossing the threshold, for he is on his parole not to put himself in Rosa's way. His sister is at least as mindful of the obligation they have taken on themselves as he can be, and loses not a moment in joining him. They meet affectionately, avoid lingering there, and walk towards the upper inland country. "I am not going to tread upon forbidden ground, Helena," says Neville, when they have walked some distance and are turning. "You will understand in another moment that I cannot help referring to, what shall I say, my infatuation?" "Had you not better avoid it, Neville? You know that I can hear nothing." "You can hear, my dear, what Mr. Crisparkle has heard, and heard with approval." "Yes, I can hear so much." "Well, it is this. I am not only unsettled and unhappy myself, but I am conscious of unsettling and interfering with other people. How do I know that, but for my unfortunate presence, you and the rest of that former party, our engaging guardian expected, might be dining cheerfully in Minor Canon Corner tomorrow. Indeed, it probably would be so. I can see too well that I am not high in the old lady's opinion, and it is easy to understand what an irksome clog I must be upon the hospitalities of her orderly house, especially at this time of year, when I must be kept asunder from this person, and there is such a reason for my not being brought into contact with that person, and an unfavourable reputation has preceded me with such another person, and so on. I have put this very gently to Mr. Crisparkle, for you know his self-denying ways, but still I have put it. What I have laid much greater stress upon at the same time is, that I am engaged in a miserable struggle with myself, and that a little change and absence may enable me to come through it the better. So, the weather being bright and hard, I am going on a walking expedition, and intend taking myself out of everybody's way, my own included, I hope, tomorrow morning. When to come back? In a fortnight. And going quite alone? I am much better without company, even if there were any one but you to bear me company, my dear Helena. Mr. Crisparkle entirely agrees, you say? Entirely. I am not sure but that at first he was inclined to think it rather a moody scheme, and one that might do a brooding mind harm. But we took a moonlight walk last Monday night to talk it over at leisure, and I represented the case to him as it really is. I showed him that I do want to conquer myself, and that, this evening well got over, it is surely better that I should be away from here just now than here. I could hardly help meeting certain people walking together here, and that could do no good. And it is certainly not the way to forget. A fortnight hence, that chance will probably be over for the time, and when it again arises for the last time, why, I can again go away. Father, I really do feel hopeful of bracing exercise and wholesome fatigue. You know that Mr. Crisparkle allows such things their full weight in the preservation of his own sound mind in his own sound body, and that his just spirit is not likely to maintain one set of natural laws for himself and another for me. He yielded to my view of the matter when convinced that I was honestly in earnest, and so, with his full consent, I start tomorrow morning. Early enough to be not only out of the streets, but out of hearing of the bells when the good people go to church. Helena thinks it over, and thinks well of it. Mr. Crisparkle doing so, she would do so. But she does originally, out of her own mind, think well of it as a healthy project denoting a sincere endeavour and an active attempt at self-correction. She is inclined to pity him, poor fellow, for going away solitary on the great Christmas festival, but she feels it much more to the purpose to encourage him. And she does encourage him. He will write to her. He will write to her every alternate day, and tell her all his adventures. Does he send clothes on in advance of him? My dear Helena, no. Travel like a pilgrim with wallet and staff. My wallet, or my knapsack, is packed and ready for strapping on, and here is my staff. He hands it to her. She makes the same remark as Mr. Crisparkle, that it is very heavy, and gives it back to him, asking what wood it is. Ironwood. Up to this point he has been extremely cheerful. Perhaps the having to carry his case with her, and therefore to present it in its brightest aspect, has roused his spirits. Perhaps the having done so with success is followed by a revulsion. As the day closes in, and the city lights begin to spring up before them, he grows depressed. I wish I were not going to this dinner, Helena. Dear Neville, is it worth while to care much about it? Think how soon it will be over. How soon it will be over, he repeats gloomily. Yes, but I don't like it. There may be a moment's awkwardness, she cheeringly represents to him, but it can only last a moment. He is quite sure of himself. I wish I felt as sure of everything else as I feel of myself, he answers her. How strangely you speak, dear. What do you mean? Helena, I don't know. I only know that I don't like it. What a strange dead weight there is in the air. She calls his attention to those copperous clouds beyond the river, and says that the wind is rising. He scarcely speaks again until he takes leave of her at the gate of the nun's house. She does not immediately enter when they have parted, but remains looking after him along the street. Twice he passes the gatehouse, reluctant to enter. At length, the cathedral clock chiming 1/4, with a rapid turn he hurries in. And so he goes up the postern stair. Edwin Drood passes a solitary day. Something of deeper moment than he had thought has gone out of his life, and in the silence of his own chamber he wept for it last night. Though the image of Miss Landless still hovers in the background of his mind, the pretty little affectionate creature, so much firmer and wiser than he had supposed, occupies its stronghold. It is with some misgiving of his own unworthiness that he thinks of her, and of what they might have been to one another, if he had been more in earnest some time ago, if he had set a higher value on her, if, instead of accepting his lot in life as an inheritance of course, he had studied the right way to its appreciation and enhancement. And still, for all this, and though there is a sharp heartache in all this, the vanity and caprice of youth sustain that handsome figure of Miss Landless in the background of his mind. That was a curious look of Rosa's when they parted at the gate. Did it mean that she saw below the surface of his thoughts and down into their twilight depths? Scarcely that, for it was a look of astonished and keen inquiry. He decides that he cannot understand it, though it was remarkably expressive. As he only waits for Mr. Grugius now, and will depart immediately after having seen him, he takes a sauntering leave of the ancient city and its neighbourhood. He recalls the time when Rosa and he walked here or there, mere children, full of the dignity of being engaged. Poor children, he thinks, with a pitying sadness. Finding that his watch has stopped, he turns into the jeweller's shop to have it wound and set. The jeweller is knowing on the subject of a bracelet, which he begs leave to submit in a general and quite aimless way. It would suit, he considers, a young bride to perfection, especially if of a rather diminutive style of beauty. Finding the bracelet but coldly looked at, the jeweller invites attention to a tray of rings for gentlemen. Here is a style of ring, now, he remarks, a very chaste signet, which gentlemen are much given to purchasing when changing their condition. A ring of a very responsible appearance, with the date of their wedding day engraved inside. Several gentlemen have preferred it to any other kind of memento. The rings are as coldly viewed as the bracelet. Edwin tells the tempter that he wears no jewellery but his watch and chain, which were his father's, and his shirt-pin. "That I was aware of," is the jeweller's reply, "for Mr. Jasper dropped in for a watch-glass the other day, and in fact I showed these articles to him, remarking that if he should wish to make a present to a gentleman relative on any particular occasion, but he said with a smile that he had an inventory in his mind of all the jewellery his gentleman relative ever wore, namely his watch and chain and his shirt-pin." Still, the jeweller considers, that might not apply to all times, though applying to the present time. 20 minutes past 2, Mr. Drood, I set your watch at. Let me recommend you not to let it run down, sir. Edwin takes his watch, puts it on, and goes out, thinking, "Dear old Jack, if I were to make an extra crease in my neckcloth, he would think it worth noticing." He strolls about and about to pass the time until the dinner hour. It somehow happens that Claustrum seems reproachful to him today, has fault to find with him, as if he had not used it well, but is far more pensive with him than angry. His wanton carelessness is replaced by a wistful looking at and dwelling upon all the old landmarks. He will soon be far away, and may never see them again, he thinks. Poor youth, poor youth. As dusk draws on, he paces the monk's vineyard. He has walked to and fro full half an hour by the cathedral chimes, and it has closed in dark before he becomes quite aware of a woman crouching on the ground near a wicket gate in a corner. The gate commands a cross-by path, little used in the gloaming, and the figure must have been there all the time, though he has but gradually and lately made it out. He strikes into that path and walks up to the wicket. By the light of a lamp near it, he sees that the woman is of a haggard appearance, and that her wizened chin is resting on her hands, and that her eyes are staring, with an unwinking, blind sort of steadfastness before her. Always kindly, but moved to be unusually kind this evening, and having bestowed kind words on most of the children and aged people he has met, he at once bends down and speaks to this woman. "Are you ill?" "No, dearie," she answers, without looking at him, and with no departure from her strange blind stare. Are you blind? No, dearie. Are you lost, homeless, faint? What is the matter that you stay here in the cold so long without moving? By slow and stiff efforts, she appears to contract her vision until it can rest upon him, and then a curious film passes over her, and she begins to shake. He straightens himself, recoils a step, and looks down at her in a dread amazement, for he seems to know her. Good heaven, he thinks next moment, like Jack that night. As he looks down at her, she looks up at him and whimpers, My lungs is weakly, my lungs is dreadful bad. Poor me, my cough is rattling dry, and coughs in confirmation horribly. Where do you come from? Come from London, dearie, her cough still rendering her. Where are you going to? Back to London, dearie. I came here looking for a needle in a haystack, and I ain't found it. Look'ee, dearie, give me 3 and 6pence, and don't you be afraid of me. I'll get back to London then, and trouble no one. I'm in a business. Ah, me, it's slack, and times is very bad, but I can make a shift to live by it. Do you eat opium? Smokes it, she replies, with difficulty, and racked by her cough. Give me 3 and 6pence, and I'll lay it out well and get back. If you don't give me 3 and 6pence, don't give me a brass farthing. And if you do give me 3 and 6pence, dearie, I'll tell you something. He counts the money from his pocket and puts it in her hand. She instantly clutches it tight and rises to her feet with a croaking laugh of satisfaction. Bless ye! Harkee, dear gentleman, what's your christened name? Edwin. Edwin. She repeats, trailing off into a drowsy repetition of the word, and then asks suddenly, Is the short of that name Eddie? It is sometimes called so, he replies, with the colours starting to his face. Don't sweethearts call it so? She asks, pondering. How should I know? Haven't you a sweetheart upon your soul? None. She is moving away with another bless ye and thank ye, dearie, when he adds, You were to tell me something. You may as well do so. So I was. Well, then, whisper, you be thankful that your name ain't Ned. He looks at her quite steadily, and he asks her, Why? Because it's a bad name to have just now. How a bad name? A threatened name. A dangerous name. The proverb says that threatened men live long, he tells her lightly. Then Ned, so threatened is he, wherever he may be while I'm a-talking to you, dearie, should live to all eternity, replies the woman. She has leaned forward to say it in his ear, with her forefinger shaking before his eyes, and now huddles herself together, and with another bless ye and thank ye, goes away in the direction of the traveller's lodging-house. This is not an inspiriting close to a dull day. Alone, in a sequestered place, surrounded by vestiges of old time and decay, it rather has a tendency to call a shudder into being. He makes for the better lighted streets, and resolves as he walks on to say nothing of this tonight, but to mention it to Jack, who alone calls him Ned, as an odd coincidence tomorrow. Of course, only as a coincidence, and not as anything better worth remembering. Still, it holds to him as many things much better worth remembering never did. He has another mile or so to linger out before the dinner hour, and when he walks over the bridge and by the river, The woman's words are in the rising wind, in the angry sky, in the troubled water, in the flickering lights. There is some solemn echo of them even in the cathedral chime, which strikes a sudden surprise to his heart as he turns in under the archway of the gatehouse. And so he goes up the postern stair. John Jasper passes a more agreeable and cheerful day than either of his guests. Having no music lessons to give in the holiday season, his time is his own, but for the cathedral services. He is early among the shopkeepers, ordering little table luxuries that his nephew likes. His nephew will not be with him long, he tells his provision dealers, and so must be petted and made much of. While out on his hospitable preparations, he looks in on Mr. Sapsea, and mentions that dear Ned and that inflammable young spark of Mr. Crispell's are to dine at the gatehouse today and make up their differences. Mr. Sapsea is by no means friendly towards the inflammable young spark. He says that his complexion is un-English, and when Mr. Sapsea has once declared anything to be un-English, he considers that thing everlastingly sunk in the bottomless pit. John Jasper is truly sorry to hear Mr. Sapsea speak thus, for he knows right well that Mr. Sapsea never speaks without meaning, and that he has a subtle trick of being right. Mr. Sapsea, by a very remarkable coincidence, is of exactly that opinion. Mr. Jasper is in beautiful voice this day. In the pathetic supplication to have his heart inclined to keep this law, he quite astonishes his fellows by his melodious power. He has never sung difficult music with such skill and harmony as in this day's anthem. His nervous temperament is occasionally prone to take difficult music a little too quickly. Today, his time is perfect. These results are probably attained through a grand composure of the spirits. The mere mechanism of his throat is a little tender, for he wears, both with his singing robe and with his ordinary dress, a large black scarf of strong, close-woven silk, slung loosely round his neck. But his composure is so noticeable that Mr. Crisparkle speaks of it as they come out from vespers. "I must thank you, Jasper, for the pleasure with which I have heard you today. Beautiful, delightful. You could not have so outdone yourself, I hope, without being wonderfully well." "I am wonderfully well." "Nothing unequal," says the Minor Canon, with a smooth motion of his hand. "Nothing unsteady, nothing forced, nothing avoided, all thoroughly done in a masterly manner, with perfect self-command." "Thank you. I hope so, if it is not too much to say. One would think, Jasper, you had been trying a new medicine for that occasional indisposition of yours." "No, really? That's well observed, for I have." "Then stick to it, my good fellow," says Mr. Crisparkle, clapping him on the shoulder with friendly encouragement. "Stick to it." "I will." "I congratulate you," Mr. Crisparkle pursues, as they come out of the cathedral, "on all accounts." "Thank you again. I will walk round to the corner with you, if you don't object. I have plenty of time before my company come, and I want to say a word to you which I think you will not be displeased to hear." "What is it?" "Well, we were speaking the other evening of my black humours." Mr. Crisparkle's face falls, and he shakes his head deploringly. "I said, you know, that I should make you an antidote to those black humours, and you said you hoped I would consign them to the flames." "And I still hope so, Jasper." "With the best reason in the world, I mean to burn this year's diary at the year's end. Because you—" Mr. Crisparkle brightens greatly as he thus begins. "You anticipated me, because I feel that I have been out of sorts, gloomy, bilious, brain-oppressed, whatever it may be. You said I had been exaggerative. So I have." Mr. Crisparkle's brightened face brightens still more. "I couldn't see it then, because I was out of sorts. But I am in a healthier state now, and I acknowledge it with genuine pleasure. I made a great deal of a very little. That's the fact." "It does me good," cries Mr. Crisparkle, "to hear you say it." "A man leading a monotonous life," Jasper proceeds, "and getting his nerves, or his stomach, out of order, dwells upon an idea until it loses its proportions. That was my case with the idea in question. So I shall burn the evidence of my case when the book is full, and begin the next volume with a clearer vision." "This is better," says Mr. Crisparkle, stopping at the steps of his own door to shake hands, "than I could have hoped." "Why, naturally," returns Jasper. "You had but little reason to hope that I should become more like yourself. You are always training yourself to be, mind and body, as clear as crystal, and you always are, and never change, whereas I am a muddy, solitary, moping weed. However, I have got over that mope. Shall I wait while you ask if Mr. Neville has left for my place? If not, he and I may walk round together." "I think," says Mr. Crisparkle, opening the entrance door with his key, "that he left some time ago. At least, I know he left, and I think he has not come back. But I'll inquire. He won't come in?" "My company wait," said Jasper with a smile. The minor canon disappears, and in a few moments returns. As he thought, Mr. Neville has not come back. Indeed, as he remembers now, Mr. Neville said he would probably go straight to the gatehouse. "Bad manners in a host," says Jasper. "My company will be there before me. What will you bet that I don't find my company embracing?" "I will bet, or I would, if I ever did bet," returns Mr. Crisparkle, "that your company will have a gay entertainer this evening." Jasper nods and laughs good night. He retraces his steps to the cathedral door and turns down past it to the gatehouse. He sings in a low voice and with delicate expression as he walks along. It still seems as if a false note were not within his power tonight, and as if nothing could hurry or retard him. Arriving thus under the arched entrance of his dwelling, he pauses for an instant in the shelter to pull off that great black scarf and bang it in a loop upon his arm. For that brief time his face is knitted and stern, but it immediately clears, and he resumes his singing and his way. And so he goes up the postern stair. The red light burns steadily all evening in the lighthouse on the margin of the tide of busy life. Softened sounds and hum of traffic pass it and flow on irregularly into the lonely precincts, but very little else goes by, save violent rushes of wind. It comes on to blow a boisterous gale. The precincts are never particularly well lighted, but the strong blasts of wind blowing out many of the lamps, in some instances shattering the frames too and bringing the glass rattling to the ground, they are unusually dark tonight. The darkness is augmented and confused by flying dust from the earth, dried twigs from the trees, and great ragged fragments from the rooks' nests up in the tower. The trees themselves so toss and creak as this tangible part of the darkness madly whirls about that they seem in peril of being torn out of the earth, while ever and again a crack and a rushing fall denote that some large branch has yielded to the storm. Not such power of wind has blown for many a winter night. Chimneys topple in the streets, and people hold to posts and corners and to one another to keep themselves upon their feet. The violent rushes abate not, but increase in frequency and fury until at midnight, when the streets are empty, the storm goes thundering along them, rattling at all the latches and tearing at all the shutters, as if warning the people to get up and fly with it, rather than have the roofs brought down upon their brains. Still, the red light burns steadily. Nothing is steady but the red light. All through the night the wind blows and abates not, but early in the morning, when there is barely enough light in the east to dim the stars, it begins to lull. From that time, with occasional wild changes, like a wounded monster dying, it drops and sinks, and at full daylight it is dead. It is then seen that the hands of the cathedral clock are torn off, that lead from the roof has been stripped away, rolled up and blown into the close, and that some stones have been displaced upon the summit of the great tower. Christmas morning though it be, it is necessary to send up workmen to ascertain the extent of the damage done. These, led by Durdles, go aloft, while Mr. Tope and a crowd of early idlers gather down in Minor Canon Corner, shading their eyes and watching for their appearance up there. This cluster is suddenly broken and put aside by the hands of Mr. Jasper. All the glazing eyes are brought down to the earth by his loudly inquiring of Mr. Crisparkle at an open window, "Where is my nephew?" "He has not been here. Is he not with you?" "No, he went down to the river last night with Mr. Neville to look at the storm, and has not been back. Call Mr. Neville." "He left this morning early." "Left this morning early? Let me in! Let me in!" There is no more looking up at the tower now. All the assembled eyes are turned on Mr. Jasper, white, half-dressed, panting, and clinging to the rail before the Minor Canon's house. Chapter 15. Impeached. Neville Landless had started so early and walked at so good a pace that when the church bells began to ring in Claustrum for morning service, he was 8 miles away. As he wanted his breakfast by that time, having set forth on a crust of bread, he stopped at the next roadside tavern to refresh. Visitors in want of breakfast, unless they were horses or cattle, for which class of guests there was preparation enough in the way of water trough and hay, was so unusual at the sign of the tilted wagon that it took a long time to get the wagon into the track of tea and toast and bacon. Neville, in the interval, sitting in a sanded parlour, wondering in how long a time after he had gone the sneezy fire of damp faggots would begin to make somebody else warm. Indeed, the tilted wagon, as a cool establishment on the top of a hill, where the ground before the door was puddled with damp hoofs and trodden straw, where a scolding landlady slapped a moist baby, with one red sock on and one wanting, in the bar, where the cheese was cast aground upon a shelf, in company with a mouldy tablecloth and a green-handled knife in a sort of cast-iron canoe, where the pale-faced bread shed tears of crumb over its shipwreck in another canoe, where the family linen, half-washed and half-dried, led a public life of lying about, where everything to drink was drunk out of mugs, and everything else was suggestive of a rhyme to mugs. The tilted wagon, all these things considered, hardly kept its painted promise of providing good entertainment for man and beast. However, man, in the present case, was not critical, but took what entertainment he could, and went on again after a longer rest than he needed. He stopped at some quarter of a mile from the house, hesitating whether to pursue the road or to follow a cart track between two high hedgerows, which led across the slope of a breezy heath and evidently struck into the road again by and by. He decided in favour of this latter track and pursued it with some toil, the rise being steep and the way worn into deep ruts. He was labouring along when he became aware of some other pedestrians behind him. As they were coming up at a faster pace than his, he stood aside against one of the high banks to let them pass. But their manner was very curious. Only 4 of them passed. Other 4 slackened speed and loitered as intending to follow him when he should go on. The remainder of the party, half a dozen perhaps, turned and went back at a great rate. He looked at the 4 behind him, and he looked at the 4 before him. They all returned his look. He resumed his way. The 4 in advance went on, constantly looking back. The 4 in the rear came closing up. When they all ranged out from the narrow track upon the open slope of the heath, and this order was maintained, let him diverge as he would to either side, there was no longer room to doubt that he was beset by these fellows. He stopped as a last test, and they all stopped. "Why do you attend upon me in this way?" he asked the whole body. "Are you a pack of thieves?" "Don't answer him," said one of the number. He did not see which. "Better be quiet." "Better be quiet," repeated Neville. "Who said so?" Nobody replied. "It's good advice, whichever of you scullers gave it," he went on angrily. "I will not submit to be penned in between 4 men there and 4 men there. I wish to pass, and I mean to pass those 4 in front." They were all standing still, himself included. "If 8 men, or 4 men, or 2 men set upon 1, he proceeded, growing more enraged, "the 1 has no chance but to set his mark upon some of them, and by the Lord I'll do it if I'm interrupted any farther." Shouldering his heavy stick and quickening his pace, he shot on to pass the 4 ahead. The largest and strongest man of the number changed swiftly to the side on which he came up, and dexterously closed with him, and went down with him, but not before the heavy stick had descended smartly. "Let him be," said this man in a suppressed voice, as they struggled together on the grass. "Fair play. He is the build of a girl to mine, and he's got a weight strapped on his back besides. Let him alone. I'll manage him." After a little rolling about, in a close scuffle which caused the faces of both to be bemersed with blood, the man took his knee from Neville's chest and rose, saying, "There, now take him arm in arm, any 2 of you." It was immediately done. "As to our being a pack of thieves, Mr. Landless," said the man, as he spat out some blood and wiped more from his face, "you know better than that at midday. We wouldn't have touched you if you hadn't forced us. We're going to take you round to the high road anyhow, and you'll find help enough against thieves there if you want it. Wipe his face, somebody. See how it's a-trickling down him." When his face was cleansed, Neville recognised in the speaker Joe, driver of the Claustrum omnibus, whom he had seen but once, and that on the day of his arrival. "And what I recommend for the present is, don't talk, Mr. Landless. You'll find a friend waiting for you at the high road, gone ahead by the other way when we split into 2 parties. And you had much better say nothing until you come up with him. Bring that stick along somebody else, and let's be moving." Utterly bewildered, Neville stared around him and said not a word. Walking between his 2 conductors, who held his arms in theirs, he went on as in a dream, until they came again into the high road and into the midst of a little group of people. The men who had turned back were among the group, and its central figures were Mr. Jasper and Mr. Crisparkle. Neville's conductors took him up to the Minor Canon, and there released him as an act of deference to that gentleman. "What is all this, sir? What is the matter? I feel as if I had lost my senses," cried Neville. the group closing in around him. "Where is my nephew?" asked Mr. Jasper wildly. "Where is your nephew?" repeated Neville. "Why do you ask me?" "I ask you," retorted Jasper, "because you were the last person in his company, and he is not to be found." "Not to be found?" cried Neville, aghast. Stay, said Mr. Crisparkle. "Permit me, Jasper. Mr. Neville, you are confounded. Collect your thoughts. It is of great importance that you should collect your thoughts. Attend to me." "I will try, sir, but I seem mad." "You left Mr. Jasper last night with Edwin Drood?" "Yes." "At what hour?" "Was it at 12 o'clock?" asked Neville, with his hand to his confused head and appealing to Jasper. "Quite right," said Mr. Crisparkle. "The hour Mr. Jasper has already named to me. You went down to the river together?" "Undoubtedly, to see the action of the wind there." "What followed? How long did you stay there?" "About 10 minutes, I should say, not more. We then walked together to your house, and he took leave of me at the door." "Did he say that he was going down to the river again?" "No, he said that he was going straight back." The bystanders looked at one another and at Mr. Crisparkle, to whom Mr. Jasper, who had been intensely watching Neville, said, in a low, distinct, suspicious voice, "What are those stains upon his dress?" All eyes were turned towards the blood upon his clothes. "And here are the same stains upon his stick," said Jasper, taking it from the hand of the man who held it. "I know the stick to be his, and he carried it last night. What does this mean?" "In the name of God, say what it means, Neville," urged Mr. Crisparkle. "That man and I," said Neville, pointing out his late adversary, "had a struggle for the stick just now, and you may see the same marks on him, sir. What was I to suppose when I found myself molested by 8 people? Could I dream of the true reason when they would give me none at all?" They admitted that they had thought it discreet to be silent, and that the struggle had taken place, and yet the very men who had seen it looked darkly at the smears which the bright cold air had already dried. "We must return, Neville," said Mr. Crisparkle. "Of course you will be glad to come back to clear yourself?" "Of course, sir." "Mr. Landless will walk at my side," the Minor Canon continued, looking around him. "Come, Neville." They set forth on the walk back, and the others, with one exception, straggled after them at various distances. Jasper walked on the other side of Neville and never quitted that position. He was silent, while Mr. Crisparkle more than once repeated his former questions, and while Neville repeated his former answers. Also, while they both hazarded some explanatory conjectures. He was obstinately silent, because Mr. Crisparkle's manner directly appealed to him to take some part in the discussion, and no appeal would move his fixed face. When they drew near to the city, and it was suggested by the Minor Canon that they might do well in calling on the mayor at once, he assented with a stern nod, but he spake no word until they stood in Mr. Sapsea's parlour. Mr. Sapsea, being informed by Mr. Crisparkle of the circumstances under which they desired to make a voluntary statement before him, Mr. Jasper broke silence by declaring that he placed his whole reliance, humanly speaking, on Mr. Sapsea's penetration. There was no conceivable reason why his nephew should have suddenly absconded, unless Mr. Sapsea should suggest one, and then he would defer. There was no intelligible likelihood of his having returned to the river and been accidentally drowned in the dark, unless it should appear likely to Mr. Sapsea, and then again he would defer. He washed his hands as clean as he could of all horrible suspicions, unless it should appear to Mr. Sapsea that some such were inseparable from his last companion before his disappearance, not on good terms with previously, and then, once more, he would defer. His own state of mind, he being distracted with doubts and labouring under dismal apprehensions, was not to be safely trusted, but Mr. Sapsea's was. Mr. Sapsea expressed his opinion that the case had a dark look. In short, and here his eyes rested full on Neville's countenance, an un-English complexion. Having made this grand point, he wandered into a denser haze and maze of nonsense than even a mayor might have been expected to disport himself in, and came out of it with the brilliant discovery that to take the life of a fellow creature was to take something that didn't belong to you. He wavered whether or not he should at once issue a warrant for the committal of Neville Landless to jail, under circumstances of grave suspicion, and he might have gone so far as to do it, but for the indignant protest of the Minor Canon, who undertook for the young man's remaining in his own house and being produced by his own hands whenever demanded. Mr. Jasper then understood Mr. Sapsea to suggest that the river should be dragged, that its banks should be rigidly examined, that particulars of the disappearance should be sent to all outlying places and to London, and that placards and advertisements should be widely circulated imploring Edwin Drood, if for any unknown reason he had withdrawn himself from his uncle's home and society, to take pity on that loving kinsman's sore bereavement and distress, and somehow inform him that he was yet alive. Mr. Sapsea was perfectly understood, for this was exactly his meaning, though he had said nothing about it, and measures were taken towards all these ends immediately. It would be difficult to determine which was the more oppressed with the horror and amazement, Neville Landless or John Jasper, but that Jasper's position forced him to be active, while Neville's forced him to be passive, there would have been nothing to choose between them. Each was bowed down and broken. With the earliest light of the next morning, men were at work upon the river, and other men, most of whom volunteered for the service, were examining the banks. All the livelong day the search went on, upon the river with barge and pole and drag and net, upon the muddy and rushy shore with jackboots, hatchet, spade, rope, dogs, and all imaginable appliances. Even at night the river was specked with lanterns and lurid fires, far-off creeks into which the tide washed as it changed, had their knots of watchers, listening to the lapping of the stream and looking out for any burden it might bear, remote, shingly causeways near the sea and lonely points of which there was a race of water, had their unwanton flaring cressets and rough-coated figures when the next day dawned. But no trace of Edwin Drood revisited the light of the sun. All that day, again, the search went on, now in barge and boat, and now ashore among the osiers, or tramping amidst mud and stakes and jagged stones in low-lying places, where solitary watermarks and signals of strange shapes showed like spectres. John Jasper worked and toiled, but to no purpose, for still no trace of Edwin Drood revisited the light of the sun. Setting his watches for that night again, so that vigilant eyes should be kept on every change of tide, he went home exhausted. Unkempt and disordered, deborded with mud that had dried upon him, and with much of his clothing torn to rags, he had but just dropped into his easy chair where Mr. Grugius stood before him. "This is strange news," said Mr. Grugius. "Strange and fearful news." Jasper had merely lifted up his heavy eyes to say it, and now dropped them again as he drooped, worn out, over one side of his easy chair. Mr. Grugius smoothed his head and face, and stood looking at the fire. "How is your ward?" asked Jasper, after a time, in a faint, fatigued voice. Poor little thing. You may imagine her condition." "Have you seen his sister?" inquired Jasper, as before. "Whose?" The curtness of the counter-question and the cool, slow manner in which, as he put it, Mr. Grugris moved his eyes from the fire to his companion's face might at any other time have been exasperating. In his depression and exhaustion, Jasper merely opened his eyes to say, "The suspected young man's." "Do you suspect him?" asked Mr. Grugris. "I don't know what to think. I cannot make up my mind." "Nor I," said Mr. Grugris. "But as you spoke of him as the suspected young man, I thought you had made up your mind. I have just left Miss Landless." "What is her state?" "Defiance of all suspicion and unbounded faith in her brother." "Poor thing." "However," pursued Mr. Grugris, "it is not of her that I came to speak. It is of my ward. I have a communication to make that will surprise you. At least it has surprised me." Jasper, with a groaning sigh, turned wearily in his chair. "Shall I put it off till tomorrow?" said Mr. Grugris. "Mind, I warn you that I think it will surprise you." More attention and concentration came into John Jasper's eyes as they caught sight of Mr. Grugris smoothing his head again, and again looking at the fire, but now with a compressed and determined mouth. "What is it?" demanded Jasper, becoming upright in his chair. "To be sure," said Mr. Grugris, provokingly, slowly and internally, as he kept his eyes on the fire, "I might have known it sooner. She gave me the opening, but I am such an exceedingly angular man that it never occurred to me. I took all for granted." "What is it?" demanded Jasper once more. Mr. Grugris, alternately opening and shutting the palms of his hands as he warmed them at the fire, and looking fixedly at him sideways, and never changing either his action or his look in all that followed, went on to reply, "This young couple, the lost youth and Miss Rosa, my ward, though so long betrothed, and so recognizing their betrothal, and so near being married—" Mr. Grugris saw a staring white face and 2 quivering white lips in the easy-chair, and saw 2 muddy hands gripping its sides. But for the hands, he might have thought he had never seen the face. "This young couple came gradually to the discovery, made on both sides pretty equally, I think, that they would be happier and better both in their present and in their future lives, as affectionate friends, or say rather as brother and sister, than as husband and wife." Mr. Grugris saw a lead-coloured face in the easy-chair, and on its surface dreadful starting drops or bubbles as if of steel. "This young couple formed at length the healthy resolution of interchanging their discoveries, openly, sensibly, and tenderly. They met for that purpose. After some innocent and generous talk, they agreed to dissolve their existing and their intended relations for ever and ever." Mr. Grugris saw a ghastly figure rise, open-mouthed, from the easy-chair, and lift its outspread hands towards its head. "One of this young couple, and that one your nephew, fearful, however, that in the tenderness of your affection for him you would be bitterly disappointed by so wide a departure from his projected life, forbore to tell you the secret for a few days, and left it to be disclosed by me, when I should come down to speak to you, and he would be gone. I speak to you, and he is gone. Mr. Grugus saw the ghastly figure throw back its head, clutch its hair with its hands, and turn with a writhing action from him. "I have now said all I have to say, except that this young couple parted firmly, though not without tears and sorrow, on the evening when you last saw them together." Mr. Grugus heard a terrible shriek, and saw no ghastly figure sitting or standing, saw nothing but a heap of torn and miry clothes upon the floor. Not changing his action even then, he opened and shut the palms of his hands as he warmed them and looked down at it. Chapter 16. Devoted. When John Jasper recovered from his fit or swoon, he found himself being tended by Mr. and Mrs. Tope, whom his visitor had summoned for the purpose. His visitor, wooden of aspect, sat stiffly in a chair, with his hands upon his knees, watching his recovery. "There, you've come too nicely now, sir," said the tearful Mrs. Tope. "You are thoroughly worn out, and no wonder." "A man," said Mr. Grugus, with his usual air of repeating a lesson, "cannot have his rest broken, and his mind cruelly tormented, and his body overtaxed by fatigue, without being thoroughly worn out." "I fear I have alarmed you," Jasper apologized faintly, when he was helped into his easy chair. "Not at all, I thank you," answered Mr. Grugus. "You are too considerate." "Not at all, I thank you," answered Mr. Grugus again. "You must take some wine, sir," said Mrs. Tope, "and the jelly that I had ready for you, and that you wouldn't put your lips to at noon, though I warned you what would come of it, you know, and you not breakfasted, and you must have a wing of the roast fowl that has been put back 20 times if it's been put back once. It shall all be on table in 5 minutes, and this good gentleman belike will stop and see you take it." This good gentleman replied with a snort which might mean yes or no, or anything or nothing, and which Mrs. Tope would have found highly mystifying, but that her attention was divided by the service of the table. "You will take something with me," said Jasper, as the cloth was laid. "I couldn't get a morsel down my throat, I thank you," answered Mr. Grugus. Jasper ate and drank almost vicariously. Combined with the hurry in his mode of doing it was an evident indifference to the taste of what he took, suggesting that he ate and drank to fortify himself against any other failure of the spirits, far more than to gratify his palate. Mr. Grugus, in the meantime, sat upright, with no expression in his face, and a hard kind of imperturbably polite protest all over him, as though he would have said, in reply to some invitation of discourse, "I couldn't originate the faintest approach to an observation on any subject whatever, I thank you." "Do you know," said Jasper, when he had pushed away his plate and glass, and had sat meditating for a few minutes, "do you know that I find some crumbs of comfort in the communication with which you have so much amazed me?" "Do you?" returned Mr. Grugus, pretty plainly adding the unspoken clause, "I don't, I thank you." After recovering from the shock of a piece of news of my dear boy, so entirely unexpected and so destructive of all the castles I had built for him, and after having had time to think of it, yes. "I shall be glad to pick up your crumbs," said Mr. Grugus, dryly. "Is there not, or is there? If I deceive myself, tell me so, and shorten my pain. Is there not, or is there, hope that, finding himself in this new position, and becoming sensitively alive to the awkward burden of explanation in this quarter, and that, and the other, with which it would load him, he avoided the awkwardness and took to flight. "Such a thing might be," said Mr. Grugus, pondering. "Such a thing has been. I have read of cases in which people, rather than face a 7 days' wonder and have to account for themselves to the idle and impertinent, have taken themselves away and been long unheard of." "I believe such things have happened," said Mr. Grugus, pondering still. "When I had, and could have, no suspicion," pursued Jasper, eagerly following the new track, "that the dear lost boy had withheld anything from me, most of all such a leading matter as this, what gleam of light was there for me in the whole black sky? When I supposed that his intended wife was here, and his marriage close at hand, how could I entertain the possibility of his voluntarily leaving this place, in a manner that would be so unaccountable, capricious, and cruel? But now that I know what you have told me, is there no little chink through which day pierces? Supposing him to have disappeared of his own act, is not his disappearance more accountable and less cruel? The fact of his having just parted from your ward is in itself a sort of reason for his going away. It does not make his mysterious departure the less cruel to me, it is true, but it relieves it of cruelty to her." Mr. Grugus could not but assent to this. "And even as to me," continued Jasper, still pursuing the new track with ardour, and, as he did so, brightening with hope, "he knew that you were coming to me. He knew that you were entrusted to tell me what you have told me. If your doing so has awakened a new train of thought in my perplexed mind, it reasonably follows that, from the same premise, he might have foreseen the inferences that I should draw. Grant that he did foresee them, and even the cruelty to me, and who am I? John Jasper, music master, vanishes." Once more, Mr. Grugus could not but assent to this. "I have had my distrusts, and terrible distrusts they have been," said Jasper, "but your disclosure, overpowering as it was at first, showing me that my own dear boy had had a great disappointing reservation from me, who so fondly loved him, kindles hope within me. You do not extinguish it when I state it, but admit it to be a reasonable hope. I begin to believe it possible." Here he clasped his hands. "That he may have disappeared from among us of his own accord, and that he may yet be alive and well." Mr. Crisparkle came in at that moment, to whom Jasper repeated, "I begin to believe it is possible that he may have disappeared of his own accord, and may yet be alive and well." Mr. Crisparkle taking a seat and inquiring, "Why so?" Mr. Jasper repeated the arguments he had just set forth. If they had been less plausible than they were, the good Minor Canon's mind would have been in a state of preparation to receive them as exculpatory of his unfortunate pupil. But he, too, did really attach great importance to the lost young man's having been, so immediately before his disappearance, placed in a new and embarrassing relation towards every one acquainted with his projects and affairs, and the fact seemed to him to present the question in a new light. "I stated to Mr. Sapsea, when we waited on him," said Jasper, as he really had done, "that there was no quarrel or difference between the two young men at their last meeting. We all know that their first meeting was unfortunately very far from amicable, but all went smoothly and quietly when they were last together at my house. My dear boy was not in his usual spirits. He was depressed, I noticed that, and I am bound henceforth to dwell upon the circumstance the more now that I know there was a special reason for his being depressed. A reason, moreover, which may possibly have induced him to absent himself. "I pray to heaven it may turn out so," exclaimed Mr. Crisparkle. "I pray to heaven it may turn out so," repeated Jasper. "You know, and Mr. Grugus should know, likewise, that I took a great prepossession against Mr. Neville Landless, arising out of his furious conduct on that first occasion. You know that I came to you, extremely apprehensive, on my dear boy's behalf, of his mad violence. You know that I even entered in my diary, and showed the entry to you, that I had dark forebodings against him. Mr. Grugus ought to be possessed of the whole case. He shall not, through any suppression of mine, be informed of a part of it, and kept in ignorance of another part of it. I wish him to be good enough to understand that the communication he has made to me has hopefully influenced my mind, in spite of its having been, before this mysterious occurrence took place, profoundly impressed against young Landless." This fairness troubled the Minor Canon much. He felt that he was not as open in his own dealing. He charged against himself reproachfully that he had suppressed, so far, the 2 points of a second strong outbreak of temper against Edwin Drood on the part of Neville, and of the passion of jealousy having, to his own certain knowledge, flamed up in Neville's breast against him. He was convinced of Neville's innocence of any part in the ugly disappearance, and yet so many little circumstances combined so woefully against him that he dreaded to add 2 more to their cumulative weight. He was among the truest of men, but he had been balancing in his mind, much to its distress, whether his volunteering to tell these 2 fragments of truth, at this time, would not be tantamount to a piecing together of falsehood in the place of truth. However, here was a model before him. He hesitated no longer. Addressing Mr. Grugus as one placed in authority by the revelation he had brought to bear on the mystery, and surpassingly angular Mr. Grugus became when he found himself in that unexpected position, Mr. Crisparkle bore his testimony to Mr. Jasper's strict sense of justice, and, expressing his absolute confidence in the complete clearance of his pupil from the least taint of suspicion, sooner or later avowed that his confidence in that young gentleman had been formed, in spite of his confidential knowledge that his temper was of the hottest and fiercest, and that it was directly incensed against Mr. Jasper's nephew by the circumstance of his romantically supposing himself to be enamoured of the same young lady. The sanguine reaction manifest in Mr. Jasper was proof even against this unlooked-for declaration. It turned him paler, but he repeated that he would cling to the hope he had derived from Mr. Grugus, and that if no trace of this dear boy were found, leading to the dreadful inference that he had been made away with, he would cherish until the last stretch of possibility the idea that he might have absconded of his own wild will. Now it fell out that Mr. Crisparkle, going away from this conference still very uneasy in his mind, and very much troubled on behalf of the young man whom he held as a kind of prisoner in his own house, took a memorable night walk. He walked to Claustrum Weir. He often did so, and consequently there was nothing remarkable in his footsteps tending that way. But the preoccupation of his mind so hindered him from planning any walk or taking heed of the objects he passed, that his first consciousness of being near the weir was derived from the sound of the falling water close at hand. "How did I come here?" was his first thought as he stopped. "Why did I come here?" was his second. Then he stood intently listening to the water. A familiar passage in his reading, about airy tongues that syllable men's names, rose so unbidden to his ear. that he put it from him with his hand, as if it were tangible. It was starlight. The weir was full 2 miles above the spot to which the young men had repaired to watch the storm. No search had been made up here, for the tide had been running strongly down at that time of the night of Christmas Eve, and the likeliest places for the discovery of a body, if a fatal accident had happened under such circumstances, all lay, both when the tide ebbed and when it flowed again, between that spot and the sea. The water came over the weir with its usual sound on a cold, starlight night, and little could be seen of it. Yet Mr. Crisparkle had a strange idea that something unusual hung about the place. He reasoned with himself. What was it? Where was it? Put it to the proof. Which sense did it address? No sense reported anything unusual there. He listened again, and his sense of hearing again checked the water coming over the weir with its usual sound on a cold, starlight night. Knowing very well that the mystery with which his mind was occupied might of itself give the place this haunted air, he strained those hawk's eyes of his for the correction of his sight. He got closer to the weir, and peered at its well-known posts and timbers. Nothing in the least unusual was remotely shadowed forth, but he resolved that he would come back early in the morning. The weir ran through his broken sleep all night, and he was back again at sunrise. It was a bright, frosty morning. The whole composition before him, when he stood where he had stood last night, was clearly discernible in its minutest details. He had surveyed it closely for some minutes, and was about to withdraw his eyes when they were attracted keenly to one spot. He turned his back upon the weir and looked far away at the sky and at the earth, and then looked again at that one spot. It caught his sight again immediately, and he concentrated his vision upon it. He could not lose it now, though it was but such a speck in the landscape. It fascinated his sight. His hands began plucking off his coat, for it struck him that at that spot, a corner of the weir, something glistened which did not move and come over with the glistening water drops, but remained stationary. He assured himself of this. He threw off his clothes, he plunged into the icy water, and swam for the spot. Climbing the timbers, he took from them, caught among their interstices by its chain, a gold watch, bearing engraved upon its back, E.D. He brought the watch to the bank, swam to the weir again, climbed it, and dived off. He knew every hole and corner of all the depths, and dived and dived and dived, until he could bear the cold no more. His notion was that he would find the body. He only found a shirt-pin sticking in some mud and ooze. With these discoveries he returned to Claustrum, and, taking Neville Landless with him, went straight to the mayor. Mr. Jasper was sent for, the watch and shirt-pin were identified, Neville was detained, and the wildest frenzy and fatuity of evil rapport rose against him. He was of that vindictive and violent nature that but for his poor sister, who alone had influence over him, and out of whose sight he was never to be trusted, he would be in the daily commission of murder. Before coming to England, he had caused to be whipped to death sundry natives, nomadic persons, encamping now in Asia, now in Africa, now in the West Indies, and now at the North Pole, vaguely supposed in Claustrum to be always black, always of great virtue, always calling themselves me and everybody else Massa or Missy, according to sex, and always reading tracts of the obscurest meaning, in broken English, but always accurately understanding them in the purest mother tongue. He had nearly brought Mrs. Crisparkle's grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. Those original expressions were Mr. Sapsey's. He had repeatedly said he would have Mr. Crisparkle's life. He had repeatedly said he would have everybody's life, and become, in effect, the last man. He had been brought down to Claustrum from London by the eminent philanthropist, and why? Because that philanthropist had expressly declared, "I owe it to my fellow creatures that he should be, in the words of Bentham, where he is the cause of the greatest danger to the smallest number." These dropping shots from the blunderbusses of the blunder-headedness might not have hit him in a vital place, but he had to stand against a trained and well-directed fire of arms of precision too. He had notoriously threatened the lost young man, and had, according to the showing of his own faithful friend and tutor, who strove so hard for him, a cause of bitter animosity, created by himself and stated by himself, against that ill-starred fellow. He had armed himself with an offensive weapon for the fatal night, and he had gone off early in the morning, after making preparations for departure. He had been found with traces of blood on him. Truly, they might have been wholly caused as he represented, but they might not also. On a search warrant being issued for the examination of his room, clothes, and so forth, it was discovered that he had destroyed all his papers and rearranged all his possessions on the very afternoon of the disappearance. The watch found at the weir was challenged by the jeweller as one he had wound and set for Edwin Drood at 20 minutes past 2 on that same afternoon, and it had run down before being cast into the water, and it was the jeweller's positive opinion that it had never been rewound. This would justify the hypothesis that the watch was taken from him not long after he left Mr. Jasper's house at midnight, in the company with the last person seen with him, and that it had been thrown away after being retained some hours. Why thrown away? If he had been murdered, and so artfully disfigured or concealed, or both, as that the murderer hoped identification to be impossible, except from something that he wore, assuredly the murderer would seek to remove from the body the most lasting, the best known, and the most easily recognizable things upon it. Those things would be the watch and shirt-pin. As to his opportunities of casting them into the river, if he were the object of these suspicions, they were easy, for he had been seen by many persons, wandering about on that side of the city, indeed on all sides of it, in a miserable and seemingly half-distracted manner. As to the choice of the spot, obviously such criminating evidence had better take its chance of being found anywhere rather than upon himself or in his possession. Concerning the reconciliatory nature of the appointed meeting between the two young men, very little could be made of that in young Landless's favour, for it distinctly appeared that the meeting originated not with him, but with Mr. Crisparkle, and that it had been urged on by Mr. Crisparkle, and who could say how unwillingly, or in what ill-conditioned mood, his enforced pupil had gone to it. The more his case was looked into, the weaker it became in every point. Even the broad suggestion that the lost young man had absconded was rendered additionally improbable on the showing of the young lady from whom he had so lately parted. For, what did she say, with great earnestness and sorrow when interrogated? That he had expressly and enthusiastically planned with her that he would await the arrival of her guardian, Mr. Grugus, and yet, be it observed, he disappeared before that gentleman appeared. On the suspicions thus urged and supported, Neville was detained and redetained, and the search was pressed on every hand, and Jasper laboured night and day. But nothing more was found. No discovery being made, which proved the lost man to be dead, it at length became necessary to release the person suspected of having made away with him. Neville was set at large. Then a consequence ensued which Mr. Crisparkle had too well foreseen. Neville must leave the place, for the place shunned him and cast him out. Even had it not been so, the dear old China shepherdess would have worried herself to death with fears for her son, and with general trepidation occasioned by their having such an inmate. Even had that not been so, the authority to which the minor canon deferred officially would have settled the point. "Mr. Crisparkle," quoth the Dean, "human justice may err, but it must act according to its lights. The days of taking sanctuary are past. This young man must not take sanctuary with us." "You mean he must leave my house, sir?" "Mr. Crisparkle," returned the prudent Dean, "I claim no authority in your house. I merely confer with you on the painful necessity you find yourself under of depriving this young man of the great advantages of your counsel and instruction." "It is very lamentable, sir," Mr. Crisparkle represented. "Very much so," the Dean assented. "And if it be a necessity," Mr. Crisparkle faltered, "as you unfortunately find it to be," returned the Dean. Mr. Crisparkle bowed submissively. "It is hard to prejudge his case, sir, but I am sensible that just so, perfectly, as you say, Mr. Crisparkle," interposed the Dean, nodding his head smoothly. "There is nothing else to be done. No doubt, no doubt. There is no alternative, as your good sense has discovered." "I am entirely satisfied of his perfect innocence, sir, nevertheless." "Well," said the Dean, in a more confidential tone and slightly glancing around him, "I would not say so, generally. Not generally. Enough of suspicion attaches to him to... No, I think I would not say so, generally." Mr. Crisparkle bowed again. "It does not become us, perhaps," pursued the Dean, "to be partisans. Not partisans. We clergy keep our hearts warm and our heads cool, and we hold a judicious middle course. I hope you do not object, sir, to my having stated in public, emphatically, that he will reappear here whenever new suspicion may be awakened or any new circumstances may come to light in this extraordinary matter." "Not at all," returned the Dean. "And yet you do know, I don't think," with a very nice and neat emphasis on those two words, "I don't think I would state it emphatically. State it? Yes, but emphatically, no, I think not. In point of fact, Mr. Crisparkle, keeping our hearts warm and our heads cool, we clergy need do nothing emphatically." So Minor Canon Rowe knew Neville Landless no more, and he went whithersoever he would or could, with a blight upon his name and fame. It was not until then that John Jasper silently resumed his place in the choir. Haggard and red-eyed, his hopes plainly had deserted him, his sanguine mood was gone, and all his worst misgivings had come back. A day or two afterwards, while unrobing, he took his diary from a pocket of his coat, turned the leaves, and with an impressive look, and without one spoken word, handed this entry to Mr. Crisparkle to read. My dear boy is murdered. The discovery of the watch and shirt-pin convinces me that he was murdered that night, and that his jewellery was taken from him to prevent identification by its means. All the delusive hopes I had founded on his separation from his betrothed wife I give to the winds. They perish before his fatal discovery. I now swear and record the oath on this page that I never more will discuss this mystery with any human creature until I hold the clue to it in my hand. That I never will relax in my secrecy or in my search. That I will fasten the crime of the murder of my dear dead boy upon the murderer, and that I devote myself to his destruction. Chapter 17. Philanthropy, Professional and Unprofessional. Full half a year had come and gone, and Mr. Crisparkle sat in a waiting-room in the London chief offices of the haven of Philanthropy, until he could have audience of Mr. Honeythunder. In his college days of athletic exercises, Mr. Crisparkle had known professors of the noble art of fisticuffs, and had attended 2 or 3 of their gloved gatherings. He had now an opportunity of observing that as to the phrenological formation of the backs of their heads. The professing philanthropists were uncommonly like the pugilists, in the development of all those organs which constitute or attend a propensity to pitch into your fellow creatures. The philanthropists were remarkably favoured. There were several professors passing in and out with exactly the aggressive air upon them of being ready for a turn-up with any novice who might happen to be on hand, that Mr. Crisparkle well remembered in the circles of the fancy. Preparations were in progress for a moral little mill somewhere on the rural circuit, and other professors were backing this or that heavyweight as good for such or such speech-making hits. So very much after the manner of the sporting publicans that the intended resolutions might have been rounds. In an official manager of these displays, much celebrated for his platform tactics, Mr. Crisparkle recognized, in a suit of black, the counterpart of a deceased benefactor of his species, an eminent public character, once known to the fame as Frosty-Faced Fogo, who in days of yore superintended the formation of the magic circle with the ropes and stakes. There were only 3 conditions of resemblance wanting between these professors and those. Firstly, the philanthropists were in very bad training, much too fleshy, and presenting, both in face and figure, a superabundance of what is known to pugilistic experts as suet pudding. Secondly, the philanthropists had not the good temper of the pugilists and used worse language. Thirdly, their fighting code stood in great need of revision, as empowering them not only to bore their man to the ropes, but to bore him to the confines of distraction, also to hit him when he was down, hit him anywhere and anyhow, kick him, stamp upon him, gouge him, and maul him behind his back without mercy. In these last particulars, the professors of the noble art were much nobler than the professors of philanthropy. Mr. Crisparkle was so completely lost in musing on the similarities and dissimilarities, at the same time watching the crowd which came and went by, always, as it seemed, on errands of antagonistically snatching something from somebody, and never giving anything to anybody, that his name was called before he heard it. On his at length responding, he was shown by a miserably shabby and underpaid stipendiary philanthropist, who could hardly have done worse if he had taken service with a declared enemy of the human race, to Mr. Honeythunder's room. "Sir," said Mr. Honeythunder, in his tremendous voice, like a schoolmaster issuing orders to a boy of whom he had a bad opinion, "sit down." Mr. Crisparkle seated himself. Mr. Honeythunder, having signed the remaining few score of a few thousand circulars, calling upon a corresponding number of families without means to come forward, stump up instantly and be philanthropists, or go to the devil. Another shabby stipendiary philanthropist, highly disinterested if in earnest, gathered these into a basket and walked off with them. "Now, Mr. Crisparkle," said Mr. Honeythunder, turning his chair half round towards him when they were alone, and squaring his arms with his hands on his knees, and his brows knitted, as if he added, "I am going to make short work of you. Now, Mr. Crisparkle, we entertain different views, you and I, sir, of the sanctity of human life." "Do we?" returned the Minor Canon. "We do, sir." "Might I ask you," said the Minor Canon, "what are your views on that subject?" "That human life is a thing to be held sacred, sir." "Might I ask you," pursued the Minor Canon as before, "what you suppose to be my views on that subject?" "By George, sir," returned the philanthropist, squaring his arms still more as he frowned on Mr. Crisparkle, "they are best known to yourself." "Readily admitted. But you began by saying we took different views, you know. Therefore, or you could not say so, you must have set up some views as mine. Pray, what views have you set up as mine?" "Here is a man, and a young man," said Mr. Honeythunder, as if that made the matter infinitely worse, and he could have easily borne the loss of an old one, "swept off the face of the earth by a deed of violence. What do you call that?" "Murder," said the Minor Canon. "What do you call the doer of that deed, sir?" "A murderer," said the Minor Canon. "I am glad to hear you admit so much, sir," retorted Mr. Honeythunder in his most offensive manner, "and I candidly tell you that I didn't expect it." Here he lowered heavily at Mr. Crisparkle again. "Be so good as to explain what you mean by those very unjustifiable expressions." "I don't sit here, sir," returned the philanthropist, raising his voice to a roar, "to be browbeaten." "As the only other person present, no one can possibly know that better than I do," returned the Minor Canon very quietly. "But I interrupt your explanation." "Murder," proceeded Mr. Honeythunder, in a kind of boisterous reverie, with his platform folding of his arms and his platform nod of abhorrent reflection after each short sentiment of a word. "Bloodshed. Abel. Cain. I hold no terms with Cain. I repudiate with a shudder the red hand when it is offered me." Instead of instantly leaping into his chair and cheering himself hoarse, as the Brotherhood in public meeting assembled would infallibly have done on this cue, Mr. Crisparkle merely reversed the quiet crossing of his legs and said mildly, "Don't let me interrupt your explanation when you begin it." "The commandments say no murder." "No murder, sir," proceeded Mr. Honeythunder, platformally pausing as if he took Mr. Crisparkle to task for having distinctly asserted that they said, "You may do a little murder and then leave off." "And they also say, you shall bear no false witness," observed Mr. Crisparkle. "Enough," bellowed Mr. Honeythunder, with a solemnity and severity that would have brought the house down at a meeting. "Enough! My late wards now being of age, and I being released from a trust which I cannot contemplate without a thrill of horror, there are the accounts which you have undertaken to accept on their behalf, and there is a statement of the balance which you have undertaken to receive, and which you cannot receive too soon. And let me tell you, sir, I wish that, as a man and a minor canon, you were better employed." With a nod, "Better employed." With another nod, "Better employed." With another, and the 3 nods added up. Mr. Crisparkle rose, a little heated in the face, but with perfect command of himself. "Mr. Honeythunder," he said, taking up the papers referred to, "my being better or worse employed than I am at present is a matter of taste and opinion. You might think me better employed in enrolling myself a member of your society." "Aye, indeed, sir," retorted Mr. Honeythunder, shaking his head in a threatening manner. "It would have been better for you if you had done that long ago." "I think otherwise." "Or," said Mr. Honeythunder, shaking his head again, "I might think one of your profession better employed in devoting himself to the discovery and punishment of guilt than in leaving that duty to be undertaken by a layman." "I may regard my profession from a point of view which teaches me that its first duty is towards those who are in necessity and tribulation, who are desolate and oppressed," said Mr. Crisparkle. "However, as I have quite clearly satisfied myself that it is no part of my profession to make professions, I say no more of that. But I owe it to Mr. Neville and to Mr. Neville's sister, and in a much lower degree to myself, to say to you that I know I was in the full possession and understanding of Mr. Neville's mind and heart at the time of this occurrence, and that without in the least colouring or concealing what was to be deplored in him and required to be corrected, I feel certain that his tale is true. Feeling that certainty, I befriend him. As long as that certainty shall last, I will befriend him, and if any consideration could shake me in this resolve, I should be so ashamed of myself for my meanness that no man's good opinion, no, nor no woman's, so gained, could compensate me for the loss of my own." Good fellow, manly fellow, and he was so modest too. There was no more self-assertion in the minor canon than in the schoolboy who had stood in the breezy playing fields keeping a wicket. He was simply and staunchly true to his duty alike in the large case and in the small. So all true souls ever are. So every true soul ever was, ever is, and ever will be. There is nothing little to the really great in spirit. "Then who do you make out did the deed?" asked Mr. Honeythunder, turning on him abruptly. "Heaven forbid," said Mr. Crisparkle, "that in my desire to clear one man I should lightly criminate another. I accuse no one." "Ta-cha!" ejaculated Mr. Honeythunder with great disgust, for this was by no means the principle on which the philanthropic brotherhood usually proceeded. "And, sir, you are not a disinterested witness, we must bear in mind." "How am I an interested one?" inquired Mr. Crisparkle, smiling innocently at a loss to imagine. "There was a certain stipend, sir, paid to you for your pupil, which may have warped your judgment a bit." said Mr. Honeythunder coarsely. "Perhaps I expect to retain it still?" Mr. Crisparkle returned, enlightened. "Do you mean that, too?" "Well, sir," returned the professional philanthropist, getting up and thrusting his hands down into his trouser pockets, "I don't go about measuring people for caps. If people find I have any about me that fit 'em, they can put 'em on and wear 'em, if they like. That's their lookout, not mine." Mr. Crisparkle eyed him with a just indignation, and took him to task thus. "Mr. Honeythunder, I hoped when I came in here that I might be under no necessity of commenting on the introduction of platform manners or platform manoeuvres among the decent forbearances of private life. But you have given me such a specimen of both that I should be a fit subject for both if I remained silent respecting them. They are detestable." "They don't suit you, I dare say, sir." "They are," repeated Mr. Crisparkle, without noticing the interruption, "detestable. They violate equally the justice that should belong to Christians and the restraints that should belong to gentlemen. You assume a great crime to have been committed by one whom I, acquainted with the attendant circumstances, and having numerous reasons on my side, devoutly believe to be innocent of it. Because I differ from you on that vital point, what is your platform resource? Instantly to turn upon me, charging that I have no sense of the enormity of the crime itself, but am its aider and abettor. So, another time, taking me as representing your opponents in other cases, you set up a platform credulity, a moved and seconded and carried unanimously profession of faith in some ridiculous delusion or mischievous imposition. I decline to believe it, and you fall back upon your platform resource of proclaiming that I believe nothing, that because I will not bow down to a false god of your making, I deny the true God. Another time you make the platform discovery that war is a calamity, and you propose to abolish it by a string of twisted resolutions tossed into the air like the tail of a kite. I do not admit the discovery to be yours in the least, and I have not a grain of faith in your remedy. Again, your platform resource of representing me as revelling in the horrors of a battlefield like a fiend incarnate. Another time, in another of your undiscriminating platform rushes, you would punish the sober for the drunken. I claim consideration for the comfort, convenience, and refreshment of the sober, and you presently make platform proclamation that I have a depraved desire to turn heaven's creatures into swine and wild beasts. In all such cases your movers, and your seconders, and your supporters, your regular professors of all degrees, run amuck like so many mad Malays, habitually attributing the lowest and basest motives with the utmost recklessness. Let me call your attention to a recent instance in yourself for which you should blush, and quoting figures which you know to be as wilfully one-sided as a statement of any complicated account that should be all creditor side and no debtor, or all debtor side and no creditor. Therefore it is, Mr. Honeythunder, that I consider the platform a sufficiently bad example and a sufficiently bad school even in public life, but hold that, carried into private life, it becomes an unendurable nuisance." "These are strong words, sir," exclaimed the philanthropist. "I hope so," said Mr. Crisparkle. "Good morning." He walked out of the haven at a great rate, but soon fell into his regular brisk pace, and soon had a smile upon his face as he went along, wondering what the China shepherdess would have said if she had seen him pounding Mr. Honeythunder in the late little lively affair. For Mr. Crisparkle had just enough of harmless vanity to hope that he had hit hard, and to glow with the belief that he had trimmed the philanthropic jacket pretty handsomely. He took himself to Staple Inn, but not to PJT and Mr. Gruger's. Full many a creaking stair he climbed before he reached some attic rooms in a corner, turned the latch of their unbolted door, and stood beside the table of Neville Landless. An air of retreat and solitude hung about the rooms and about their inhabitant. He was much worn, and so were they. Their sloping ceilings, cumbrous rusty locks and grates, and heavy wooden bins and beams, slowly mouldering withal, had a prisonous look, and he had the haggard face of a prisoner. Yet the sunlight shone in at the ugly garret window, which had a penthouse to itself thrust out among the tiles, and on the cracked and smoke-blackened parapet beyond, some of the deluded sparrows of the place rheumatically hopped, like little feathered cripples who had left their crutches in their nests, and there was a play of living leaves at hand that changed the air, and made an imperfect sort of music in it that would have been melody in the country. The rooms were sparely furnished, but with good store of books. Everything expressed the abode of a poor student. That Mr. Crisparkle had been either chooser, lender, or donor of the books, or that he combined the three characters, might have been easily seen in the friendly beam of his eyes upon them as he entered. "How goes it, Neville?" "I am in good heart, Mr. Crisparkle, and working away." "I wish your eyes were not quite so large and not quite so bright," said the Minor Canon, slowly releasing the hand he had taken in his. "They brighten at the sight of you," returned Neville. "If you were to fall away from me, they would soon be dull enough." "Rally, rally," urged the other, in a stimulating tone. "Fight for it, Neville." "If I were dying, I feel as if a word from you would rally me. If my pulse had stopped, I feel as if your touch would make it beat again," said Neville. "But I have rallied, and am doing famously." Mr. Crisparkle turned him with his face a little more towards the light. "I want to see a ruddier touch here, Neville," he said, indicating his own healthy cheek by way of pattern. "I want more sun to shine upon you." Neville drooped suddenly as he replied in a lowered voice, "I am not hardy enough for that yet. I may become so, but I cannot bear it yet. If you had gone through those Claustrum streets as I did, if you had seen, as I did, those averted eyes, and the better sort of people silently giving me too much room to pass, that I might not touch them or come near them, you wouldn't think it quite unreasonable that I cannot go about in the daylight." "My poor fellow," said the Minor Canon, in a tone so purely sympathetic that the young man caught his hand. "I never said it was unreasonable, never thought so, but I should like you to do it." "And that would give me the strongest motive to do it, but I cannot yet. I cannot persuade myself that the eyes of even the stream of strangers I pass in this vast city look at me without suspicion. I feel marked and tainted even when I go out, as I do only at night, but the darkness covers me then, and I take courage from it." Mr. Crisparkle laid a hand upon his shoulder and stood looking down at him. "If I could have changed my name," said Neville, "I would have done so, but as you wisely pointed out to me, I can't do that, for it would look like guilt. If I could have gone to some distant place, I might have found relief in that, but the thing is not to be thought of for the same reason. Hiding and escaping would be the construction in either case. It seems a little hard to be so tied to a stake and innocent, but I don't complain. And you must expect no miracle to help you, Neville, said Mr. Crisparkle compassionately. No, sir, I know that. The ordinary fullness of time and circumstances is all I have to trust to. It will right you at last, Neville. So I believe, and I hope I may live to know it. But perceiving that the despondent mood into which he was falling cast a shadow on the Minor Canon, and, it may be, feeling that the broad hand upon his shoulder was not then quite as steady as its own natural strength had rendered it when it first touched him just now, he brightened and said, "Excellent circumstances for study, anyhow, and you know, Mr. Crisparkle, what need I have of study in all ways, not to mention that you have advised me to study for the difficult profession of the law, specially, and that, of course, I am guiding myself by advice of such a friend and helper, such a good friend and helper." He took the fortifying hand from his shoulder and kissed it. Mr. Crisparkle beamed at the books, but not so brightly as when he had entered. "I gather from your silence on the subject that my late guardian is adverse, Mr. Crisparkle?" The Minor Canon answered, "Your late guardian is a most unreasonable person, and it signifies nothing to any reasonable person whether he is adverse, perverse, or the reverse." "Well, for me, that I have enough with economy to live upon," sighed Neville, half wearily and half cheerily, "while I wait to be learned, and wait to be righted. Else I might have proved the proverb that while the grass grows, the steed starves." He opened some books as he said it, and was soon immersed in their interleaved and annotated passages, while Mr. Crisparkle sat beside him, expounding, correcting, and advising. The Minor Canon's cathedral duties made these visits of his difficult to accomplish, and only to be compassed at intervals of many weeks. But they were as serviceable as they were precious to Neville Landless. When they had got through such studies as they had in hand, they stood leaning on the window-sill and looking down upon the patch of garden. "Next week," said Mr. Crisparkle, "you will cease to be alone, and will have a devoted companion." "And yet," returned Neville, "this seems an uncongenial place to bring my sister to." "I don't think so," said the Minor Canon. "There is duty to be done here, and there are womanly feeling, sense, and courage wanted here." "I meant," explained Neville, "that the surroundings are so dull and unwomanly, and that Helena can have no suitable friend or society here." "You have only to remember," said Mr. Crisparkle, "that you are here yourself, and that she has to draw you into the sunlight." They were silent for a little while, and then Mr. Crisparkle began anew. "When we first spoke together, Neville, you told me that your sister had risen out of the disadvantages of your past lives as superior to you as the tower of Claustrum Cathedral is higher than the chimneys of Minor Canon Corner. Do you remember that?" "Right well. I was inclined to think it at the time an enthusiastic flight, no matter what I think it now. What I would emphasize is that under the head of pride your sister is a great and opportune example to you." "Under all heads that are included in the composition of a fine character, she is." "Say so, but take this one. Your sister has learned how to govern what is proud in her nature. She can dominate it even when it is wounded through her sympathy with you. No doubt she has suffered deeply in those same streets where you suffered deeply. No doubt her life is darkened by the cloud that darkens yours. But bending her pride into a grand composure that is not haughty or aggressive, but is a sustained confidence in you and in the truth, she has won her way through those streets until she passes along them as high in the general respect as anyone who treads them. Every day and hour of her life since Edward Drood's disappearance, she has faced malignity and folly, for you, as only a brave nature well directed can. So it will be with her to the end. Another and weaker kind of pride might sink broken-hearted, but never such a pride as hers, which knows no shrinking and can get no mastery over her. The pale cheek beside him flushed under the comparison and the hint implied in it. "I will do all I can to imitate her," said Neville. "Do so, and be a truly brave man, as she is a truly brave woman," answered Mr. Crisparkle stoutly. "It is growing dark. Will you go my way with me when it is quite dark? Mind, it is not I who wait for darkness." Neville replied that he would accompany him directly. But Mr. Crisparkle said he had a moment's call to make on Mr. Grugus as an act of courtesy, and would run across to that gentleman's chambers and rejoin Neville on his own doorstep if he would come down there to meet him. Mr. Grugus, bolt upright as usual, sat taking his wine in the dusk at his open window, his wine-glass and decanter on the round table at his elbow, himself and his legs on the window-seat, only one hinge in his whole body, like a bootjack. "How do you do, Reverend Sir?" said Mr. Grugus, with abundant offers of hospitality, which were as cordially declined as made. "And how is your charge getting on over the way in the set that I had the pleasure of recommending to you as vacant and eligible?" Mr. Crisparkle replied suitably. "I am glad you approve of them," said Mr. Grugus, "because I entertain a sort of fancy for having him under my eye." As Mr. Grugus had to turn his eye up considerably before he could see the chambers, the phrase was to be taken figuratively and not literally. "And how did you leave Mr. Jasper, Reverend Sir?" said Mr. Grugus. Mr. Crisparkle had left him pretty well. "And where did you leave Mr. Jasper, Reverend Sir?" Mr. Crisparkle had left him at Claustrum. "And when did you leave Mr. Jasper, Reverend Sir? That morning?" Said Mr. Grugus. "He didn't say he was coming, perhaps?" "Coming where?" "Anywhere, for instance," said Mr. Grugus. "No, because here he is," said Mr. Grugus, who had asked all these questions with his preoccupied glance directed out at window. "And he don't look agreeable, does he?" Mr. Crisparkle was craning towards the window when Mr. Grugus added, "If you will kindly step round here behind me in the gloom of the room, and will cast your eye at the second-floor landing window in yonder house, I think you will hardly fail to see a slinking individual in whom I recognize our local friend." "You are right," cried Mr. Crisparkle. Said Mr. Grugus. Then he added, turning his face so abruptly that his head nearly came into collision with Mr. Crisparkle's, "What should you say that our local friend was up to?" The last passage he had been shown in the diary returned on Mr. Crisparkle's mind with the force of a strong recoil, and he asked Mr. Grugus if he thought it possible that Neville was to be harassed by the keeping of a watch upon him. "A watch?" repeated Mr. Grugus, musingly. "Aye." "Which would not only of itself haunt and torture his life," said Mr. Crisparkle warmly, "but would expose him to the torment of a perpetually reviving suspicion, whatever he might do, or wherever he might go." "Aye," said Mr. Grugus, musing still. "Do I see him waiting for you?" "No doubt you do." "Then would you have the goodness to excuse my getting up to see you out, and to go out and join him, and to go the way that you were going, and to take no notice of our local friend?" said Mr. Grugus. "I don't entertain a sort of fancy for having him under my eye tonight, do you know?" Mr. Crisparkle, with a significant need, complied, and, rejoining Neville, went away with him. They dined together and partied at the yet unfinished and undeveloped railway station. Mr. Crisparkle to get home, Neville to walk the streets, cross the bridges, make a wide round of the city in the friendly darkness, and tire himself out. It was midnight when he returned from his solitary expedition and climbed his staircase. The night was hot, and the windows of the staircase were all wide open. Coming to the top, it gave him a passing chill of surprise, there being no rooms but his up there, to find a stranger sitting on the window-sill, more after the manner of a venturesome glazier than an amateur ordinarily careful of his neck. In fact, so much more outside the window than inside, as to suggest the thought that he must have come up by the waterspout instead of the stairs. The stranger said nothing until Neville put his key in his door, then, seeming to make sure of his identity from the action, he spoke. "I beg your pardon," he said, coming from the window with a frank and smiling air and a prepossessing address. "The beans." Neville was quite at a loss. "Runners," said the visitor. "Scarlet, next door at the back." "Oh," returned Neville. "And the mignonette and wallflower?" "The same," said the visitor. "Pray walk in." "Thank you." Neville lighted his candles, and the visitor sat down. A handsome gentleman with a young face, but with an older figure in its robustness and its breadth of shoulder, say a man of 28, or at the utmost 30. So extremely sunburnt that the contrast between his brown visage and the white forehead, shaded out of doors by his hat, and the glimpses of white throat below the neckerchief, would have been almost ludicrous but for his broad temples, bright blue eyes, clustering brown hair, and laughing teeth. "I have noticed," said he. "My name is Tartar." Neville inclined his head. "I have noticed, excuse me, that you shut yourself up a good deal, and that you seem to like my garden aloft here. If you would like a little more of it, I could throw out a few lines and stays between my windows and yours, which the runners would take to directly. And I have some boxes, both of mignonette and wallflower, that I could shove on along the gutter, with a boat-hook I have by me, to your windows, and draw back again when they wanted watering or gardening, and shove on again when they were shipshape, so that they would cause you no trouble. I couldn't take this liberty without asking your permission, so I ventured to ask it. Tartar, corresponding set, next door." "You are very kind." "Not at all. I ought to apologise for looking in so late, but having noticed, excuse me, that you generally walk out at night, I thought I should inconvenience you least by awaiting your return. I am always afraid of inconveniencing busy men, being an idle man." "I should not have thought so from your appearance." "No? I take it as a compliment. In fact, I was bred in the Royal Navy, and was first lieutenant when I quitted it. But an uncle disappointed in the service, leaving me his property on condition that I left the Navy. I accepted his fortune and resigned my commission." "Lately, I presume?" "Well, I had 12 or 15 years of knocking about first. I came here some 9 months before you. I had one crop before you came. I chose this place because, having served last in a little corvette, I knew I should feel more at home where I had a constant opportunity of knocking my head against the ceiling. Besides, it would never do for a man who had been aboard ship from his boyhood to turn luxurious all at once. Besides, again, having been accustomed to a very short allowance of land all my life, I thought I'd feel my way to the command of a landed estate by beginning in boxes." Whimsically, as this was said, there was a touch of merry earnestness in it that made it doubly whimsical. "However," said the lieutenant, "I have talked quite enough about myself. It is not my way, I hope. It has merely been to present myself to you naturally. If you will allow me to take the liberty I have described, it will be a charity, for it will give me something more to do, and you are not to suppose that it will entail any interruption or intrusion on you, for that is far from my intention." Neville replied that he was greatly obliged, and that he thankfully accepted the kind proposal. "I am very glad to take your windows in tow," said the lieutenant. "From what I have seen of you when I have been gardening at mine, and you have been looking on, I have thought you, excuse me, rather too studious and delicate. May I ask, is your health at all affected?" "I have undergone some mental stress," said Neville, confused, "which has stood me in the stead of illness." "Pardon me," said Mr. Tartar. With the greatest delicacy he shifted his ground on the windows again, and asked if he could look at one of them. On Neville's opening it, he immediately sprang out, as if he were going aloft with a whole watch in an emergency, and was setting a bright example. "For heaven's sake," cried Neville, "don't do that! Where are you going, Mr. Tartar? You'll be dashed to pieces." "All well," said the lieutenant, coolly looking about him on the housetop. "All taut and trim here. Those lines and stays shall be rigged before you turn out in the morning. May I take this short cut home and say good night?" "Mr. Tartar," urged Neville, "pray, it makes me giddy to see you." But Mr. Tartar, with a wave of his hand and the deftness of a cat, had already dipped through his scuttle of scarlet runners without breaking a leaf, and gone below. Mr. Grugus, his bedroom window blind held aside with his hand, happened at that moment to have Neville's chambers under his eye for the last time that night. Fortunately, his eye was on the front of the house and not the back, or this remarkable appearance and disappearance might have broken his rest as a phenomenon. But Mr. Grugus, seeing nothing there, not even a light in the windows, his gaze wandered from the windows to the stars, as if he would have read in them something that was hidden from him. Many of us would, if we could, but none of us so much as know our letters in the stars yet, or seem likely to do it, in this state of existence. And few languages can be read until their alphabets are mastered. Chapter 18. A Settler in Claustrum. At about this time, a stranger appeared in Claustrum, a white-haired personage with black eyebrows. Being buttoned up in a tightish blue surtout, with a buff waistcoat and grey trousers, he had something of a military air, but he announced himself at the Crozier, the orthodox hotel where he put up with a portmanteau, as an idle dog who lived upon his means, and he farther announced that he had a mind to take a lodging in the picturesque old city for a month or two, with a view of settling down there altogether. Both announcements were made in the coffee-room of the Crozier, to all whom it might or might not concern, by the stranger as he stood with his back to the empty fireplace, waiting for his fried sole, veal cutlet, and pint of sherry. And the waiter, business being chronically slack at the Crozier, represented all whom it might or might not concern, and absorbed the whole of the information. This gentleman's white head was unusually large, and his shock of white hair was unusually thick and ample. "I suppose, waiter," he said, shaking his shock of hair as a Newfoundland dog might shake his before sitting down to dinner, "that a fair lodging for a single buffer might be found in these parts, eh?" The waiter had no doubt of it. "Something old," said the gentleman. "Take my hat down for a moment from that peg, will you? No, I don't want it. Look into it. What do you see written there?" The waiter read, "Datcherty." "Now you know my name," said the gentleman. "Dick Datcherty. Hang it up again. I was saying something old is what I should prefer. Something odd and out of the way. Something venerable, architectural, and inconvenient." "We have a good choice of inconvenient lodgings in the town, sir, I think," replied the waiter, with modest confidence in its resource that way. "Indeed, I have no doubt we could suit you that far,